Joining us now on the line via Skype from Copenhagen, Denmark, Gerald Butts. Gerald is the CEO of the World Wildlife Fund and a former principal secretary to Ontario's Premier Dalton McGuinty. And Gerald, how are you? I guess, what is it, the middle of the night there now? How are you today?
It's late evening, Steve. I feel great. Thanks. Just getting over the jet lag.
Okay, we've heard that the talks temporarily broke down today in Copenhagen. What happened?
Well, what happened was you had the developing nations of the world begging the rich nations of the world to take the first step when it comes to meaningful reductions on climate change. I think there's been a great debate around north-south lines in the lead up to Copenhagen, and we're seeing what most observers predicted would happen is actually transpiring. That you've got some of the poorest people on Earth who, not incidentally, are going to be the most significantly and negatively impacted by climate change, looking for a helping hand from the developed world.
We heard the Australian climate change minister say today, this is a walkout over process and form, not a walkout over substance. A, what does she mean by that? B, do you agree with her?
Well, it's slightly true, I'd put it that way, Steve. I think that the issue is what part of the debate is going to get settled first. Are we going to talk about how we bring developing nations into the protocol, into a two-track conversation about how meaningful reductions are actually allocated and who does what over the next 10 years? And the other side of it is what about the obligations that the developed world, the so-called Annex 1 countries, have already made and haven't lived up to? This is a very significant issue here. So while there's a lot of sympathy for the developed world's viewpoint that, look, China in 2009 is not China in 1997. So there's got to be a meaningful way to bring China into the process, especially given the fact that they're the world's largest emitter now. At the same time, the developed world is looking at us and saying, what have you done for us lately? There are a lot of countries, including our own, Steve, that made very significant commitments in the Kyoto Protocol that did not live up to it.
Okay, a bunch of things to follow up on there. I know many of the countries that are there negotiating think that it's important to keep Kyoto at the centerpiece of whatever goes forward. But as you just pointed out, China is not a part of that. The United States was not a part of that. Canada signed it and is not following it. So does it make sense for Kyoto still to be the foundation upon which whatever comes next is built?
Well, I think it's important for us to remember that there's another compliance period left to unfold for Kyoto, and countries have made very significant commitments on constructive actions that they're obliged now to take over that period. So you have quite a few countries saying, well, what happens if there is no, do we just sort of absolve the countries who committed to making those reductions from those reductions? I think this is a very serious issue. I think it's been mischaracterized a little bit, especially in the West. But you basically have a bunch of poor nations asking the developed world whether or not we're all going to live up to our word.
Well, that's one of the issues, isn't it? I mean, some people in the developed world think that this is just a bid by the developing countries to get more money out of them, and it's got more to do with politics than the environment. What's your view on that?
I think that's normally propagated by people who don't want to see a deal. And it's just one of many excuses that are used not to sign one. I think that, like many arguments such as that, there's a grain of truth to it. But in the end, if we're going to end look, in the end, Steve, the issue does not respect political jurisdiction. This is a planetary problem, and we have to come together as a species to solve it. So there's no end of opportunities for people to blame one another and countries to blame one another for where we are. That's not the issue that your kids and mine care about. The issue that they are going to care about is what kind of world they're going to inherit. And the decisions that are made here this week are going to go a long way to determining that future for them.
I appreciate this isn't a discussion about political jurisdictions, and having said that, I'm going to ask you a question about a political jurisdiction anyway. Canada, we all want to know, of course, what our delegation is doing and whether it's making a contribution. What do you know?
Well, I think, look, I'd like to take a step back from the current debate about what's going on in Canada. I think that the reason we're in the pickle we're in, so to speak, as a country, and I don't wholly blame the current government for this. This problem fundamentally has its roots in the 1990s, when you had one half of the government trying to make oil sands very economically feasible. 50 of the top people in Finance Canada, Industry Canada, and PCO were trying to figure out how to make oil sands extraction economical. And nobody put environmental concerns on the table within that discussion. But at the same time, you had 50 people in another part of the government trying to figure out how the country was going to ratify Kyoto. And nobody ever put those two conversations together. So I think that the current government has justifiably been criticized for inaction on this file, but I think it's really important to understand the context they're in.
No, that's a fair point, Gerald, but I'm wondering as well if you, I mean, the Canadian government is over there speaking with one voice. We also see British Columbia and Ontario and Quebec are all over there speaking with somewhat different voices. All of their voices, however, we're told are more ambitious than the federal government's voice. Is that muddying up Canada's message at all?
I don't think Canada has a clear, coherent message, Stephen. I think that I have sympathies, as you know, in this front with the Ontario government and their plan, and I was part of that, so I need to kind of put those biases on the table. But you do have a situation in this country where at the subnational level, provinces like Ontario, provinces like Quebec, BC, Manitoba have laid out very ambitious plans, and they've not only have they done that, they've actually made some real positive steps toward realizing them. And that I think that's an important voice to be heard here in Copenhagen, so that people don't think that the Canadian government is Canada.
Well, let me follow up on that, though. They always used to say that foreign policy debates should end, at Newfoundland or in the United States, off the eastern seaboard.
No debates ever end in Newfoundland, Stephen. You know that.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough. But are the provinces, as well-meaning as you clearly think they are, are they causing, for lack of a better expression, our side or our government or whatever our message ought to be, are they muddying up the works by trying to get out there ahead of the federal government?
Well, there's definitely an argument to be made for keeping domestic policy issues out of foreign policy. But that, I think, is one of the aspects of this issue, climate change, that make it different from just about any other issue we've ever dealt with. It is a very strong collision between foreign policy and domestic policy. And you've got a bunch of provinces who represent a lot of people in the country and who represent a lot of economic interests in the country who are being hurt by the Canadian government's position. And I think that it's their responsibility to speak up for their constituents. So I don't blame them one bit.
Okay, I hear you, but John Geraldson is Ontario's Environment Minister, and he's over there saying some pretty tough things about our federal government right now, and he's saying them in front of a foreign audience. And I wonder if down the road there's a price to be paid for that kind of bluntness.
Possibly. I think that's a good question. I wouldn't predict the future on that. But we're, of course, not the only government that has its loyal opposition with them this week. I think that there's a senator whose name escapes me right now who will be trailing behind President Obama, who will be making a very strong argument that the Senate's never going to ratify any kind of greenhouse gas reduction treaty, so don't listen to anything this man says. I think this is the price of democracy, Steve, in the end, that we do have disparate voices, we do have a diverse range of opinions in the country, and in a federation like ours, we've got very consequential governments taking different positions.
Okay, we know the Ontario government's position is more ambitious than the federal government's position. Ontario wants to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 15% below 1990 levels by the year 2020. Can you kind of paint a picture for us as to how that might affect our daily lives, the nature of our economy, and so on going forward, if in fact that more ambitious target were to happen?
If it were to happen nationally?
If it were to happen provincially?
Provincially. Well, I think people are already feeling the consequences of it. It's a different way of producing the electricity we consume largely, and that's modestly more expensive. So I think that people are paying more on their electricity bills because we've made a decision that we want to internalize all the costs of producing energy in the province instead of just creating a big debt that somebody else has to pay for sometime down the road. I think it's going to mean some changes in the way we get ourselves from place to place. I think our cars are going to be a little more tightly regulated. Hopefully there'll be more public transit opportunities over time. Look, there's no secret that the biggest sources of emissions in Ontario have been from the electricity sector, from the transportation sector, and from deforestation. And I think the government's plan, and again, I'm not unbiased on this, as you know, but the government's plan rightly tackles those things in sequence.
Now, the Harper government's position, which has been to say they're not about waving magic wands, they're all about practical, achievable targets. Do you think that's a defensible position?
I think it is in some cases. I don't think it's. I don't think it's defensible in this case. I think that we've got the capacity in Canada to. We've got, by some studies estimate we have the best renewable capacity in the world. We've got leading edge technologies in the country. We're a very wealthy country, and we should be able to crack this nut without devastating the economy. I mean, in the end, it depends on what your view of the economy is, Steve. If you look at the Canadian economy today, it hasn't really changed that much in 142 years. We still generally take things out of the ground and sell them. If you look at, or burn them, as the case may be, and if you look at, I'm not saying that's there's anything wrong with that. If it's part of your economy, my father did that for a living for 40 years. I think it's got to be balanced though by more innovative, less energy-intensive activity. If you look at the Globe and Mail, the ROB's top 20 companies in Canada last year, you had 14 resource companies, 4 banks, RIM and Thomson Reuters. That's not a picture of a balanced economy in my view.
We're about to engage in a debate on the other side of the studio on whether climate change is or is not responsible for what's happening in the South Pacific Islands, which some claim are drowning because of climate change.
Right.
And I want to get your sense on, first of all, what kind of an impact have the small islands had in Copenhagen so far?
I think they've had a very strong impact, Tuvalu in particular. When you have the leader of a nation saying, act or my nation's going to disappear off the face of the earth, I think that's a pretty powerful message that's hard to ignore. And, you know, you're always going to find people who say that there's some other cause for this. I think that's getting increasingly laughable as more and more science mounts. You have some of the most distinguished, decorated scientists in the world in Copenhagen this week. And there still remains no single peer-reviewed study that disputes anthropogenic causes for climate change. I think that it's unfortunate what happened with the emails in the East Anglia case, but I think AP did a report today that there may have been some ill-chosen words, but there's absolutely no evidence of fraud there.
There will be those, though, Gerald, who will say, look at this, you know, this is a country we're talking about here of 15,000 people. Should we turn the world's economy upside down in order to, this is what they would say. Do we turn the world's economy upside down in order to try to save an island where 15,000 people live, or shouldn't we just move them somewhere else? What do you say to that?
Well, I'd say we've tried that quite a bit in our own country over the years with indigenous peoples, for one thing. And I'd also say that, you know, who are we to make that choice for them? I think you don't need to turn the world's economy upside down to save these places. And in fact, in the case of the Maldives, you have a leader who's doing precisely what you described. He wants to buy a land where he can move his country to when it becomes unsustainable to stay there. So, and you know, now that you mention it, I think it gets back to the first question you asked. What are the responsibilities of the developed world to the developing world? And if we've caused this problem, maybe we ought to pay the relocation fee if it comes to that.
Gerald, it's awfully good of you to stay up late and join us tonight on TVO. Thanks so much.
It's a pleasure to be here, Steve. Thank you.